In the future war, we see humanity fighting Skynet with large forces. Not just small teams, but waves of infantry backed up with supporting vehicles. But how did humanity keep its military forces supplied and fighting? It would require a monumental logistics chain, and given the state of the world after Judgment Day, it's a very interesting topic. So Judgment Day has happened. Skynet has instigated a global nuclear war, and remember this happened in 1997 in the original timeline, so that's what I'm basing this off. Nuclear fire has killed around 3 billion people and wiped out the modern global world as we know it. No one knows exactly what is destroyed during the nuclear exchange, but we can take a good guess and say every major city in most nations is now gone. And in my opinion, Skynet would have wanted to cause maximum casualties, so it would have gone after the most densely populated urban areas globally. That's the only way I can see 3 billion people being killed in a nuclear exchange. And the immediate knock-on effect of this loss of life is obviously huge. Those 3 billion people were a mix of the young to the old, but a large proportion of them would have had jobs that had some kind of purpose that provided a good or service to the people around them. And I think people underestimate the gaps in the supply chains and the production of basic goods this would cause. Think about it. Imagine you produce cars. There are hundreds if not thousands of individual parts. Everything from the spark plugs to the tyres. Some of these parts aren't as important as others, but if a single major component is missing, the car isn't going to work. And making these parts is a skill, normally a fairly unique skill, and only so many people have the required knowledge and ability to do this. So in the new world, many of the basic objects we rely on would no longer be able to be maintained or repaired, as the persons whose job it was to make them are either dead, or there's so few of them left it would be difficult to actually find them. And even if you do find the person, their skills are in high demand. So how are you going to pay them? Money doesn't matter anymore, it's going to require trade. So I hope you brought some clean water and jelly beans, because that's the only way I'm going to work for you. It's not just the loss of people that would hit humanity hard. In the global world where trade is in abundance with every single nation sharing things with each other, many of our more modern technologies rely on things that aren't available locally, such as rare earth metals, which are only available in larger amounts in specific nations. So in this new world, scavenging would be the main way we were able to reclaim some of this stuff, and that would play a major part in the future war. Scavengers are always portrayed as the bottom of the supply chain, nothing more than dirty civilians in rags trading a bit of scrap for the next meal. Well, this is far from the truth, and immediately after Judgment Day, scavenging as well as looting and straight up theft would be the main way people got what they needed to survive. People's first priorities would be food and water, and not just any types. Non-perishable goods like tinned and airtight sealed would be top of the list, and bottled drinks would also be as important, not just because these lasted for years, but also so they were mobile. And this is a key thing. It's all well and good as having a water source like a well, and it has nice, clear, beautiful water that you can drink, but that means you're tied to a location, and as more threats begin to appear, either human or machine, well, you're either going to have to fight to protect it, or flee. And if you don't have mobile food and water, then you're going to starve or die of dehydration. So it's not just about the quality of the food, but also what you can take with you. Scavengers that had secured the basic supplies would now go for more specific things: medicine, weaponry and vehicles. These would be hugely important and in high demand, and we would see the emergence of larger groups, who had the means to organise but also the ability to assert dominance over the local area. These would be mini scavenger kingdoms, and these groups would have huge power in terms of being able to trade with one another, but also in terms of force. They would have large numbers of humans and most likely decent weaponry, which they would have scavenged from places such as police stations, gun shops, and maybe even military bases on the smaller side, but that's if they had the firepower to go up against the remnants of the military, but that is obviously very tricky, and it's very rare that these scavenger forces would have been able to overwhelm the old military forces, as they would have still been pretty well armed and very well trained. This would all change once humanity became aware of Skynet and its relentless machine forces. Now they weren't just small groups fighting over goods, but they were going up against a major military force. Even the strongest scavenger groups would not stand a chance against even the most basic machine forces. This is where we would see the spark of the human resistance, where the remnants of the military and government personnel would begin to form together against this new threat. It would also push people to begin to attempt to support the resistance, as for most there was no deal to be made with the machines, and it was a death sentence to try to negotiate with Skynet. Now some may be asking, how was the resistance even able to put up a fight against Skynet in the first place? Well, at the start of the future war, most of the supplies before Judgment Day would have been untouched, and the remnants of the military would have had access to large amounts of weapons, rations, vehicles, and equipment of all types, everything from repair tools to advanced communication gear. This, combined with trained military personnel, will allow them to form the most dominant human forces. No scavenger groups would be able to stand up to these men. These were well armed, well equipped, and had armoured vehicles to support them. And once they established communication between the hundreds of small military surviving groups around the globe, and especially around America where obviously Terminator is more based, the numbers would be tens of thousands of well-trained troops. This would allow the Resistance to secure all major supply locations that hadn't been raided. Think large food warehouses, industrial yards, even dockyards with thousands of unopened cargo containers with very useful stuff that was ripe for the picking. They would take what was needed and then move to safer locations and then prepare for the war against Skynet. The Resistance also had a major advantage over other scavenger groups. It had high-ranking ex-military personnel who had the locations of confidential military supplies and stockpiles, but also the access codes and keys to get in there. So for instance, a bunker full of weapons and ammunition may have huge blast doors. Well, the Resistance would have been able to get through these and have access to all these supplies. This gave them a major advantage over others, and these stockpiles may have been absolutely enormous. Imagine a military stockpile prepared for a war with, say, US versus Russia. You might have billions of rounds of ammunition and hundreds of thousands of weapons in a single location. But now the obvious problem would have been Skynet's forces. But at the start of the future war, they were rather limited in numbers and power. And this gave humanity breathing room to actually recover from Judgment Day a little, as machines such as the T-200, which were deployed at the start of the future war, weren't a match for trained military personnel with heavy weapons and armoured vehicles, but bigger threats like HK aerials would have been guarding Skynet's primary installations in case of attack. This would lead human forces to begin to migrate away from Skynet-held territory, and we would have seen large amounts of people fleeing once they realised the new threat of the machines. As the war progressed, we would see major ramp-ups in numbers and quality of the machines Skynet deployed. It would make everything from scavenging to transportation of goods almost impossible without armed support. Like the future war scenes with Kyle Reese and his supporting soldiers, they're moving through the ruins with civilians looking ragged and scared, hiding in the basements of old buildings. That's how I imagine going into the waste for resources would play out, and things like farms, workshops, and anything on the larger scale would be at high risk of being struck by Skynet, as the machines knew that we need far more to survive than them. This became a war of attrition, not just in people, but also resources. So now the Resistance had formed, it would begin to assert dominance over the areas it was located. No human force could match them in military terms, and with the large amounts of supplies and specialist personnel, think military doctors, mechanics and armourers, they had very valuable services which the civilian population desperately needed. So scavengers could trade what they had for seeing a doctor, or maybe getting an armourer to repair their scavenged M16. It was a symbiosis between the desperate and the Resistance, but the Resistance had the stronger cards in the deck. They would tell the scavengers what it would cost to, for instance, see a doctor. It might be 2 tins of food, it might be a radio in decent condition. The scavengers were on the back foot here as, well, might makes right. It's all good saying, well, I have this, tin of food if you want it, but if a Resistance soldier points his gun in his face and says, look, we're having it, well, that's probably going to happen. In the early years of the war, I honestly think the Resistance would have simply seized a large amount of supplies from people. They would have wanted to save humanity, but once they learned of what Skynet was unleashing upon the world, there would have been panic, and the need to fight back immediately would have crept in. Remember, Skynet was in its most vulnerable state, building up its military forces and itself scavenging for supplies, and high-ranking military personnel that had survived would have known Skynet's major locations and also that it was very vulnerable, so an immediate strike back would have been priority. So supplies for civilians would have been a back thought. Everything would have gone to the war effort and an immediate fight back against the machines. And obviously we know this failed as the war went on for, I believe, about 3 decades almost. So humanity attempted to fight back early on, it failed, and unfortunately, as always, the civilians pay the price. And I think this may have scared civilians away from the Resistance, and may have been how Skynet was able to get human collaborators and law people into its labour and prison camps. In times of a crisis, the military tends to overreach, and the future war would be no different. I think once the Resistance realised that this would be a long war of attrition, and they needed the civilian population to support them for any chance to survive, it would lead to a better understanding between the civilians and the Resistance long term. And human clashes between scavengers and the Resistance would have been fairly common in the early future war, as some of these scavenger groups would have been large and their leaders were basically small-time warlords, who opposed having their power challenged by the resistance, and retribution would have come swift and hard, with many a scavenger's blood being spilled across the battlefield, and I imagine sometimes it being as brutal as possible to make sure the rest of humanity got in line, and realised it's either fight with the resistance or you go to Skynet, which as most of us would know was either death through a quick plasma shot or slow, back-breaking labour. And human settlements would have sprung up all over the world. Their own communities that survived well enough would support the resistance in return for them keeping the machines at bay. And many would have been under kind of mafia-style protection deals, cough up the supplies or we'll leave you to Skynet. The resistance had to be brutal to win the future war, and when people look back on all the actions taken, I'm sure will look just as brutal as the machines. But sometimes it takes brutality to win a war. As the war raged on and Skynet's strength grew, which resulted in humanity's numbers beginning to drop even further, scavengers became even more important. The resistance would have burnt through its initial supplies, and some would have been destroyed by Skynet as it began to advance its annihilation line through human-held territory. Every single bullet and bandage would increase in rarity, and how supplies were distributed would have varied wildly depending on the commander of that resistance cell. But most would have only given supplies to personnel for fulfilling useful roles to the resistance, and anyone who was non-essential would be left to starve. It's harsh, but sympathy and compassion were in very short supply in the future war. So all that talk about starvation brings me to the biggest logistics issue in the future war: food. Now this is going to be a massive one, as industrial farming is completely gone, and the further we get into the war, the more non-perishable food would be left, as it's obviously been eaten and just supplies run out in general. So fresh grown food would have to be produced. Not in the amounts before Judgment Day, as humanity's population is far lower, thanks to the machines obviously. But think about this. Industrial farming machinery and vehicles are basically gone, so you're farming by hand, with maybe a horse or a mule if you're lucky. Then we've got the huge changes in the environment. We've got radiation, dust that's been kicked into the air. We've got less sunlight because of this. We've also got potentially even a nuclear winter, depending on what actually happens on a mass nuclear engagement. Now, no one knows exactly, but the nuclear winter theory is definitely there. What I do know for sure, crop yields are going to be far lower, and the amount of people that are needed to keep everyone fed is going to be massive. Think like the ancient world, where a far larger amount of the population were employed in food production and agriculture. We did see some interesting uses of Skynet tech to grow food. One such one was the technology used to create the organic shell on Terminators such as the T-800 was repurposed to grow meat, obviously lab-grown meat, and beef was mentioned, but you could use it to grow everything from pork to duck, so delicious for the resistance fighters. And resistance greenhouses and hydroponic gardens were being controlled with captured CPUs from destroyed Skynet machines to maximise the crop yields. This is massively effective, and if enough resources were put into this, you could make a lot of food from a very limited area with minimal staff. It's absolutely ingenious by the resistance, and this could solve the food problems that would occur, obviously, with the amount of damage that's been done to the world due to the Judgment Day and the nuclear war. One source of food people don't like to talk about is good old human meat. Yes, cannibalism. This would have most certainly happened when people became desperate, and everyone says they would never want to do it, but once the hunger gets worse and you can only hear the rumble of your belly, well, madness begins to creep in and humanity goes into very dark places. With the various resistance cells making up the overall human war effort, we would also see a lot of internal politics. This would actually impact massively on what supplies different cells got. It only takes one well-placed officer with favourites to mess it up for everyone. So certain resistance cells might have been overflowing with gear and more ample in supplies like food and luxuries, where another cell which is fighting the machines every day taking heavy losses in desperate need of everything. And actually, if we look back in our history, especially World War II, many battles were actually lost because certain units got more supplies and better gear than other ones because they were someone's favourite. It's a stupid thing to happen, but unfortunately, humanity is rather stupid at times. And officers being very political in nature may even allow resistance forces to go without to advance their own career. Many would be thinking about their prospects after the war is won, and humans are pretty selfish in nature. I would not be surprised if Officer Jellybaby, let's call him, allowed a resistance unit to be wiped out so his own forces could complete the mission and gain himself favour with the higher up officers. Unfortunately, we will always be fighting against our own nature. Let's hope after the war is won, anyone found guilty of this misuse of power is executed via Hydrobot. We would also see a major change in how supplies were collected as the war got more intense. As Skynet lost more of its machines to the resistance and civilian forces, the more of its tech we could acquire. The first major way was reprogramming of things like plasma weapons. This gave you an instant useful resource, with the only price being killing a Skynet machine of whatever type, or having the ability to hack it. And hacking became pretty widespread, but obviously that's another video entirely. Next, you have the conversion, as some things wouldn't be directly used. For instance, something like an eye of a T500 was a powerful optical sensor. This could have been made into something like an advanced CCTV style camera, or even built into a digital sight for a weapon. There are so many applications for Skynet's machines parts, and the Resistance became extremely adept at making wacky yet useful contraptions. Also, simply stripping destroyed machines to the bare bones. Something like a HK aerial, once you've removed the heavy plasma cannon and its more valuable components, has large amounts of advanced alloy metals and rare earth metals, also synthetic materials, that would be non-existent to the surviving humans up until this point in the war. Something like hyper-alloy could be melted down, and maybe instead of steel plates in your body armour, you could be rocking hyper-alloy ones. So Skynet, eat your heart out, it's my hyper-alloy now. But who would go out to claim all this valuable machine tech and scrap? Well, the Resistance soldiers and technicians' time was too valuable, and there were also too few in number to do this effectively, so it would most likely fall to scavenger groups that had deals with the Resistance. These trusted allied groups would get first dibs on such an area, and after they salvaged what was useful, they would turn it into the Resistance for payment in, obviously, goods or services. And these groups would most likely be better armed and looked after than most civilians, so they could fight off other scavengers and potentially even bandits. Now, bandits and raiders would have had their place in the future war. Many would turn to such a life as it's far easier to kill and steal than it is to work hard or learn a useful skill. We've seen this throughout history, and in the early years, banditry would have been rife. These groups would target the weak and the vulnerable, taking everything they had and leaving them for dead. And trading would have been off the table for these people, as no one likes to trade with thieves and killers. Now, the Resistance, once formed, would fight against banditry, but it was a secondary threat compared to the machines, and we would see it all the way to the end of the future war. Skynet would have also had its own impact on bandits. It would allow them to grow in strength, especially if they were hitting human and civilian forces. Now, once they had grown into a significant force that it may be a threat to Skynet's machines, it would either recruit them as collaborators, they could be used in labour camps or prisons, or it would simply terminate them. It wasn't difficult for the machines to take on a group of bandits. As we talked earlier about reclaimed Skynet tech, well, to repurpose this required a lot of skill, and as the Resistance grew, people with skill sets such as doctors and engineers were of high priority. They became VIPs, normally getting protection and some extra care, as their contribution to the war effort was massive. But the future war really changes the way we view valuable skills. For instance, a stockbroker has little value in the wasteland, but someone such as a seamstress who can repair clothes, or even a housewife who's a damn good cook and used to feeding a full family on a budget, would become very valuable. It would flip what our society considers valuable skills on its head, and people like actors and politicians, well, let's just say I imagine they wouldn't last long, so the future war does have its perks. And as the war raged on, the rebuilding of infrastructure would happen in a limited basis. Things like foundries to reuse all the scrap material that gets brought in, and small workshops would pop up in old basements and bunkers, out of sight of Skynet's patrolling machines, so the workers could produce weapons, ammunition and gadgets to keep the soldiers on the front lines fighting. And we would see children made into apprentices so they could learn a trade, and by the time they got to adulthood would be masters in their field. The rebuilding of factories and larger industry could happen once areas became secured and Skynet had been pushed back significantly. But still it would be a risky endeavour, as it would only require a HK aerial or a long-range missile to blow it to bits and destroy all the valuable resources put into it and kill lots of skilled workers and technicians. This would obviously be a massive blow to the Resistance, so this had to be done very strategically and they had to be heavily defended. To be a child in the future war was brutal. Upon learning to walk and talk, you're going to be pulling your own weight. And it wouldn't be uncommon to see children as young as 5 or 6 out scavenging for anything of value. And they would be very useful in scavenger teams as they could fit into small gaps to get the goodies hidden inside the ruins of the old world. And if they couldn't scavenge, well, they would be expected to pull their weight around the base. Cleaning, moving of gear, and even looking after the guard dogs. There was no naughty step in the future war. You either worked or you didn't eat, and you got kicked out the bunker and you had to fend for yourself against a T-600. So suck on that, Super Nanny. This is proper discipline. One thing that is overlooked is the transportation of goods, as the road and rail networks are in an awful state, and sea and air transport's just not going to happen with the machines ruling the air and the waves. And with Skynet having regular patrols on anything but the most secluded back roads, if you move over anywhere in a vehicle, you're going to attract a lot of attention. That's if you even had a vehicle, with the Resistance having the majority of them, and the actual means to get fuel for them is another issue. As petrol and diesel has a shelf life of about 6 to 8 months, you're most likely going to need synthetic fuels like biodiesel. This leaves most logistics to be done on foot until humanity began to push Skynet forces back. It means a lot more trips back and forth to move large quantities of goods, and anything particularly heavy like a car engine or a plasma cannon is going to be almost impossible to move by hand. You're going to need a specialist vehicle, which are in extremely short supply, so obviously transportation of goods is a major issue, and like I said, it's all good finding stuff, but getting it to where it's needed is, well, a different ballpark. On the subject of vehicles, a major glaring issue with the Resistance is keeping military vehicles such as armoured personnel carriers, tanks, helicopters and jets in supplies. All of these take a monumental amount of fuel, technical and maintenance support, and skilled crews to keep working in any sense of an operational function. So these would have been in very limited amounts, and the Resistance would have used things like simple trucks, vans and cars that were up-armoured and maybe had weapons added to them, and specialist vehicles would have been kept safe until they were absolutely needed. Captured Skynet vehicles may have played a major role in the Resistance forces in the later stages of the war, as they ran off internal plasma reactors, so no need for fuel. As they were captured and salvaged, there was ample spare parts and probably many spares in Skynet facilities, as the machines were still able to build on an industrial scale. And if you capture, let's say, a Skynet transport and lose it, well, it's not as much of a loss, as there will be more seized as humanity has more victories. And once humans had captured enough of Skynet's power sources, we may have seen the Resistance vehicles running off those very same sources themselves. It wouldn't be far-fetched to have electric vehicles or things like tanks converted to run off a plasma reactor. All it takes is knowledge and a will to give it a try. I think we would end up seeing vehicles a bit like from the Orcs from 40k, so remember lads, paint it red to go faster and slap on some big guns for more DACA. And talking about those plasma reactors, well, the Resistance and humanity would have been running off various power sources, but mainly things like generators and small amounts of solar. But once they've captured enough of these plasma reactors and mastered the technology, humanity's infrastructure for power would be revolutionised. Not only just in the later stages of the war, but after Skynet is defeated, we would potentially have an infinite power source that's very clean and efficient. This is truly an amazing thing to have, and in a sense Skynet gave us the best energy technology ever whilst trying to defeat us. I'm also intrigued to see if a currency would develop over time, and I think it obviously would. Direct trade would be used for a lot of things, for instance 20 tins of food and a car battery for a shotgun and some shells, but as we get further into the future war, and let's say I brought in, a plasma reactor from a HK tank in good condition, you can't simply just say, oh, here's some food. You may have to give me something that I can trade in later, or even for smaller pieces of goods here and there. So would it be something like the Metro universe where they use military grade ammunition? I think one thing would be microchips taken from Terminator machines. They were used in all manner of Resistance tech, so actually that would be a good currency to base things off. But obviously, give me your opinions on what you think would be a good currency to use in the long run of the future war. And as humanity began to win the war and liberate areas, they would capture Skynet facilities, and some of these would be labour camps, everything from mines to raw material refining centres. Now my heart says they would free the prisoners and try to help them, but my mind just knows, given how desperate the situation was, we would probably keep a fair few people working in these places. Now conditions would be a hell of a lot better than under Skynet, but you're still living in a fairy tale land if you think that it was all sunshine and rainbows with the Resistance. It took strength, resilience and most importantly sacrifice to fight the machines. In essence, we lost some of our humanity to win the war. An odd outcome of the future war would be a weird shift in tech in many areas. Even though the Resistance eventually started to use advanced plasma weaponry, we'd also see them use the most robust and technologically simple vehicles for combat and transport. It's an odd situation where we needed the most advanced tech in specific areas, but if possible we went for easy to run and repair, even though it wasn't the best tool for the job. It's better to have a simple tool that works decently than a super high tech tool that's amazing but we simply don't have the resources to keep it maintained and working. And as things like plasma weapons became more common, conventional small arms would lose most of their worth. It's interesting that supply and demand economics hold up in any given scenario, and I can just imagine some greedy scavenger who's held on to a lot of M16s waiting for the Resistance to become more desperate for them. Then all of a sudden plasma guns are now available, and his M16s become almost worthless. That's what you get for being a greedy scav. Now I'll take one M16 for a bottle of mouthwash, thanks. Now, obviously this was quite an interesting video on logistics. It covers so many things. I hope obviously I covered all the major ones and some of the minor ones. If I missed anything, obviously put it in the comments. I can obviously make more videos in future, but hopefully I did it justice. And more of these kind of theory mixed with official canon videos to come if you enjoyed them. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone, and you have a beautiful evening as always.